At my husband's company gala, he forced a champagne tray into my hands before 200 guests. Go serve them. Hide help. Welcome to her revenge. This is my new story. At my husband's company's 10th anniversary gala, surrounded by 200 high society guests, he calmly pushed a champagne tray into my hands. Do something useful. You useless thing, he said, smiling as if I were the hired help. His sister laughed and called me a cheap decoration. I quietly kept serving, still keeping the smile on my face. Then a powerful man walked toward me, bowed his head with unmistakable respect, and said one sentence that made their faces turn as pale as ghosts. Stay with me on her revenge, because what happens next is the part no one in that room ever forgot. I am so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Tell me in the comments what city or country are you joining from today. You would be surprised how far this community reaches. This story includes fictional elements crafted for narrative and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The message underneath all of it, however, is one I hope stays with you. The mirror in the dressing room did not lie. I stood there for exactly 43 seconds. I know because I counted looking at the woman staring back at me. Simple black dress. No statement jewelry, hair pulled back just enough to look effortless. In my left hand, a silver serving tray I had picked up from the catering station 2 minutes earlier. I did not look like Vivian Caldwell tonight. That was the point. To everyone in that mansion, I was exactly what they expected me to be. Harlan Weston's wife. The one he had married 5 years ago for reasons that, depending on who was telling the story, ranged from a momentary lapse in judgment to a mid-career weakness for a pretty face. I had no degree worth mentioning at dinner parties. No career. No ambition beyond keeping the house looking appropriate and showing up on time to events like this one. I was, as Harlan's sister Sloane once put it, at a charity luncheon in Bear. Decorative, but not particularly necessary. I had smiled at that. Sloane had taken it as submission. She was not the first person to mistake my silence for surrender. I set the tray down on the dressing table and took one more look at myself. The woman in the mirror looked tired, a little underdressed for the occasion, and completely unremarkable against the backdrop of what was waiting outside that door. 200 guests. Every one of them worth more money than most people would see in 3 lifetimes. Good. Unremarkable was exactly where I needed to be tonight. The Weston estate in Beverly Hills was not a home. It was a statement. 12,000 square feet of imported marble vaulted ceilings and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more per centerpiece than most Americans paid in monthly rent. The rear terrace overlooked a canyon, and someone had strung soft amber lights between the palm trees. So the whole property glowed like something out of a film set. A jazz quartet played near the fountain. Low, smooth. The kind of music designed to make wealthy people feel even wealthier. Tonight was the 10-year anniversary gala for Weston Global, the international fashion conglomerate that Harlan had built, or more accurately had inherited the foundation of and then expanded aggressively through methods that his annual reports described as innovative financial structuring. 200 guests. Champagne at $400 a bottle. A guest list that read like a directory of Los Angeles power. I had attended 6 of these events as Harlan's wife. This was the first one where I had arrived with a plan. I stepped out of the dressing room and into the corridor that led to the main hall. The sound hit me first, led conversations, crystal glasses touching heels on marble, then the smell, fresh flowers, expensive cologne, the particular combination that I had come to associate with rooms where serious money changed hands and nobody talked directly about it. I picked up a fresh tray from the catering station near the corridor entrance and walked into the main hall. The staffing situation was immediately obvious. A party of this size, Harlan's events coordinator, had told me 3 weeks ago they were bringing in 20 servers, was running on 11. I counted twice. 11 people covering a space that needed at least double that. Moving faster than they should have to, already looking frayed at the edges. And the evening had barely started. In 5 years of attending Weston Global events, I had never seen Harlan cut the serving staff. Harlan did not cut corners on appearances. Appearances were the entire architecture of his life. which meant the shortage was not an accident. I filed that away and kept moving. He was standing near the center of the room when I first saw him. Harren Weston, 41 years old, wearing a charcoal suit that had been fitted to him by a tailor in Milan 3 weeks ago. He was laughing at something a man in a navy blazer had said, one hand loose around a glass of bourbon, the other resting easily in his pocket. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to look like. Successful, relaxed, completely in command of the room. He was good at this. I had always given him that. Then his eyes moved across the crowd and found me. The laugh stayed on his face. It was a specific kind of smile. The one that never touched his eyes. The one I had spent the first year of our marriage misreading as distraction. And the following 4 years learning to read correctly. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he turned back to his conversation like I was furniture he had glanced at and found satisfactory. I kept walking. Near the far end of the room, Sloane Weston Harlan's younger sister, 29 years old, wearing something backless and expensive, was positioned beside a man I recognized from the financial press. Marcus Pennington. Quiet, steady-looking. He was listening to Sloane talk with the patient expression of someone who genuinely did not need to fill every silence, which set him apart from approximately everyone else in the room. Against the far wall, mostly still holding a glass of white wine she had not touched, stood Margaret Weston, Harlan's mother, 63, silver-haired, the kind of woman who had been called formidable so many times the word had stopped meaning anything. She was watching the room with the focused attention of someone keeping score. Her eyes passed over me without stopping. Same as always. I adjusted my grip on the tray and kept my expression exactly where it needed to be. Pleasant, neutral, slightly invisible. And then I felt it across the room. Harlan had detached from his conversation. He was moving now, unhurried, threading through the crowd with the relaxed certainty of a man who owned the floor he was walking on. His eyes were fixed on me with a look I recognized immediately. 5 years had taught me every version of that smile. This one, easy, almost warm, with just the faintest edge underneath, was the one he wore when he had already decided how the evening was going to go. And it never meant anything good. 15 minutes later, I understood exactly why the serving staff was running at half capacity tonight. Harlan reached me near the center of the room. Right where the lighting was brightest. Right where the most people could see without having to turn their heads. That was not a coincidence. Nothing Harlan did in public was ever a coincidence. He took the silver tray from my hands before I could say a word. Not roughly. That was never his style. He lifted it smoothly like he was doing me a favor and held it out at the precise angle that made it look like he was presenting it to me rather than handing it back. There she is, he said loud enough to carry. He was smiling at the couple nearest to us. The Galloway's aerospace money. 3rd year attending the Western Gala. My wife. The most decorative person in any room she walks into. He let that settle for exactly 1 beat. Then he pressed the tray gently back into my hands. We're short on staff tonight. Sweetheart, do you mind just circulate with the champagne? You're good at carrying things. The word sweetheart landed the way he intended it to. Soft enough to sound affectionate, sharp enough to cut. Around us, a few guests offered polite smiles. Robert Galloway found something interesting to look at near the far window. His wife kept her expression carefully neutral, the way people do when they have witnessed something uncomfortable, and decided the cleanest response is to pretend they have not. I took the tray. Of course, I said. My voice came out exactly the way I needed it to, mild, agreeable. Utterly without friction. Harlan's smile widened slightly. He had expected that. He always expected that. Good girl. He said it quietly, almost as an aside. Already turning back toward the Galloways. Already done with me. I stood there for 1 moment. Tray in hand. Smile in place. And I counted. Not seconds. I counted the guests within earshot who had heard every word. 14. I noted which ones had reacted and how. Filed it away. Then I started moving. I had covered maybe 20 feet when Sloane appeared at my left shoulder. Harlan's sister had a talent for materializing exactly when her presence would cause the most damage. She was 29, effortlessly polished, and had spent the better part of 5 years treating me with the specific brand of contempt that required no raised voice and left no marks. "You know," she said, falling into step beside me like we were simply two women having a conversation. "I tried to tell Harren before the wedding that a prenup wasn't enough. You really need to do a full background check. Credentials, employment history." She plucked a glass of champagne from my tray without asking. "But he was very committed to the idea of you." She took a slow sip, moving across the room like she was already bored with me. "I used to wonder what you actually did before all this. Before the house and the credit cards and the invitations to parties. You'd never have gotten into on your own." She tilted her head slightly. "Then I realized it didn't matter. You're decorative, Vivienne. Like a very expensive vase. Pretty to look at. Not especially useful. And easily replaced when the style changes." She smiled the same smile Harlan used, the family trademark, and walked away toward a group near the bar. I watched her go. 14 years of training teaches you to observe people under pressure. Not just what they say. What they choose to emphasize. What they're afraid of underneath the performance. Sloane's version of cruelty was rehearsed and precise. Which meant it wasn't casual. It meant something had made her nervous enough to sharpen it tonight specifically. I kept that thought and kept moving. The next 40 minutes followed a pattern I recognized. Harren would surface near me every 10 to 12 minutes. Never for long. Never obviously. But always within range of at least one cluster of guests. He would say something that sounded on its surface like the ordinary friction of a long marriage. Something about how I had forgotten to confirm the florist. Something about the dress being a little plain for the occasion. Small things. Each one delivered with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that his audience might be taking notes. I smiled each time. I agreed where agreeing cost me nothing. I moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who needs an audience is refuse to perform for one. But I was taking notes. By 8:00, I had counted the exits for, including the service corridor behind the east kitchen. I had identified the 3 guests most likely to have direct financial entanglements with Western Global based on the body language around Harlan's conversations. I had clocked the security rotation. 2 private guards on a 12-minute circuit. 1 stationed at the front entrance. 1 floating near the rear terrace. None of that was something a neglected housewife should have been thinking about. I was crossing back toward the catering station when I saw him. He was standing near the corridor that led to the service hallway. Partially turned away. Dressed in the black uniform of the catering staff. Holding a tray of empty glasses. Average height. Mid-30s. Dark hair cut close on the sides. To anyone else in that room, he would have registered as part of the furniture. But I had seen that face before. Not here. Not at any event like this. Somewhere that had nothing to do with champagne and imported marble and Harren Weston's anniversary party. My chest did something it was not supposed to do. I kept walking. I did not change my pace. I did not look back. But every nerve in my body had just shifted from observation to alert. I excused myself from the nearest conversation with a word about needing air and walked toward the hallway that led to the rear balcony. The tray went onto a cart near the corridor entrance. I kept my pace. Even my shoulders relaxed my expression, carrying the mild distraction of a woman who had been on her feet for an hour and wanted 2 minutes of quiet. No one looked twice. The balcony ran the full width of the estate's rear elevation, a long stretch of stone railing overlooking the canyon below, where Beverly Hills dissolved into a scatter of lights that went on for miles. The air out here was cooler, carrying the faint dry warmth that came off the hills at the end of a September day. Inside, the party continued its layered performance. Out here, it was just wind and distance. I stepped to the far end of the balcony, turned so my back was to the glass doors, and pulled out the secondary phone. The screen showed a single notification. Red banner. Federal monitoring system. The automated alert network tied to my legal identity. Not my operational profile. The kind of system that ran quietly in the background and only spoke up when something significant broke the surface. I read it once. Then I read it again. A commercial loan of $2.5 million originated under my full legal name and social security number had entered default status as of 4:37 this afternoon. The originating institution had filed a notice of delinquency with the Federal Credit Registry. Pursuant to standard IRS employee financial disclosure requirements, the alert had been routed directly to my secure monitoring account. 30 seconds. That was how long I gave myself to process it. The same interval I had trained myself to use when information arrived that required a response rather than a reaction. 30 seconds to let the data settle, to separate what I knew from what I was assuming, to identify the next logical question. What I knew? Someone had taken out a $2.5 million loan in my name. The loan was now in default. This had happened without my knowledge or consent. What I was assuming, Harren. The assumption required almost no work. Harlan had been operating under the belief for the duration of our marriage that I was financially dependent on him. No independent income, no assets of my own, no professional standing that might complicate a divorce. He would also have known, because he paid attention to the things that served him, that my personal credit profile was clean. 11 years of a government salary paid on time. No consumer debt. No financial irregularities of any kind. I was, from a lending perspective, a very attractive cosigner for a man whose own credit had been quietly deteriorating for 2 years. What I did not yet know was who had extended him $2.5 million when every institutional lender with standard due diligence protocols would have seen the Western global financial picture and said no. I was still working through that question when the balcony door opened behind me. I had the phone back in my pocket before she cleared the threshold. Sloane crossed the balcony without hurrying, a fresh glass of something sparkling in her right hand. She stopped about 4 feet away, leaned against the railing with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed casual, and looked out at the city rather than at me. "Beautiful night," she said. "It is," I said. She let a moment pass. Then Harlan had his attorney draw something up this week. A separation agreement. It's straightforward. You sign, you leave with what you came in with, which, as we both know, wasn't much, and everyone moves forward cleanly. She took a small sip. He was going to have someone present it to you formally, but I told him I'd take care of it. Keep things civil. I looked at her profile against the canyon lights. That was considerate of you. I thought so. Another pause. He wants it done before the end of the month. There's no need to drag it out. You don't have children together. You don't have shared business interests. There's nothing complicated here, Vivian. Just a marriage that ran its course. And if I have questions about the terms, then you hire an attorney and they'll talk to his attorney. She finally looked at me direct flat. The performance of civility fully dropped now that she had covered the opening pleasantries. But I'd encourage you not to make this difficult. Harlan has been very patient with you. The agreement is generous given what you actually contributed to this household. You should take it and be grateful. I held her gaze for a moment. I'll think about it, I said. Something shifted in her expression. The faintest edge of frustration. The kind that appears when someone has prepared for resistance and gotten compliance instead, and finds compliance somehow more aggravating. Don't think too long, she said. She pushed off the railing, straightened her dress, and moved back toward the doors. Some situations have a window. Miss it and the terms get less favorable. She went inside. I stood at the railing and listened to the city for a moment. Then I took out the secondary phone again and looked at the alert. The loan amount. The default notice. The originating institution. I had been focused on the numbers. The 2.5 million. The timeline. The mechanics of how someone uses another person's identity to access capital they have no right to. I had been building the logical chain in my head, working through the question of who would extend that kind of credit to a man with Harlan's current financial profile. The name of the lending institution had been there on the screen the whole time. I read it now. Really read it. And then I read it a second time because the first time did not seem possible. I came down the staircase at the same pace I had gone up. Even unhurried. The walk of a woman returning from a powder room. Nothing more. The main hall spread out below me as I descended 200 guests. The jazz quartet cycling through its third set of the evening, Harland near the center of the room where the light was best. From up here, I could see the whole of it the way you cannot when you are standing inside it. The geometry of the conversations, the way certain clusters formed around money and others formed around proximity to money, which is a different thing entirely. The people near Harland moved like planets around a fixed point, not because they wanted to necessarily, but because the gravitational logic of the room made it the path of least resistance. I stopped on the landing for a moment and let myself look. 30 seconds. That was all I allowed. Then I continued down. Here is what I want you to understand about Pinnacle Capital, because the name means nothing on its own and it needs to mean something for the rest of this to make sense. Pinnacle Capital presented itself as a private commercial lending firm. Bridge loans. Short-term financing for businesses in transition. The kind of operation that fills the gap between what institutional banks will approve and what a struggling company actually needs to survive the next quarter. Clean website. Harren called me into his study at 8:45. His tone so polite I knew immediately this was not an invitation. That particular brand of politeness had a texture I had learned to recognize over 5 years of marriage. It arrived in a lowered register in sentences that never quite finished their edges. In the careful spacing between words that told you the speaker had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. It was the politeness of a man who had already decided the outcome and was now extending you the courtesy of believing you had a choice. I set my serving tray on the hallway credenza, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked up the staircase at the pace of a woman who had nothing to fear. The study door was already open. The room was a careful performance of power floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining 3 walls. A dark walnut desk wide enough to seat a small committee. A brass fixture overhead casting amber light that made everything below it look warmer than it was. The bookshelves held legal volumes, financial texts, and the kind of first edition hardcovers a decorator selects for their spines rather than their contents. Harlan stood behind the desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. A deliberate signal. The man who entertained in the lobby wore a costume. This version, sleeves up, jaws set, was the one underneath. Sloane was already in the far corner near the window, arms folded at her chest, wearing the particular expression of someone who had been waiting longer than expected, and found it beneath her. She said nothing when I entered. She didn't need to. Harlan gestured toward the leather chair across the desk. Sit down. Vivian. I sat. He opened the top drawer without rush, withdrew a cream-colored document, and placed it on the desk between us with the deliberate precision of someone setting down a winning hand. Divorce agreement, he said. My attorneys finalized it this afternoon. 12 pages. The terms are straightforward. I looked at the document without reaching for it. You'll note, he continued, clasping his hands on the desk, that the terms reflect the full scope of our original prenuptial arrangement. You came into this marriage without significant assets. The agreement simply asks that you leave the same way. And if I don't sign? I asked. He tilted his head, the expression of a man entertaining a question he considered beneath the occasion. Then I released the documentation I've prepared on the Pinnacle Capital loan. He said, $2.50 million. Vivian. Your name. Your signature. Your credit profile attached to a defaulted commercial loan from a lender currently under federal scrutiny. He paused. I imagine your employment prospect, such as they are, would become considerably more limited. From the corner, Sloane exhaled slowly, the sound of someone watching a performance go exactly as rehearsed. Harlan, I said, do you remember the marital financial agreement we signed in year 2? A shift. Slight. Something moved across his face. Not concern. Not quite. But a rapid internal scan. His mental files checking the relevant entries. Of course. He said. All of it. A beat. The relevant portions. I nodded. Then you remember the addendum. Section 14. Paragraph C. Something tightened in his jaw. Not visible to Sloane. But I was closer. The asset clause. He said. The asset clause. I confirmed. Which specifies that in the event either party to this marriage is convicted of a federal criminal offense, All personal assets individually and jointly held are subject to immediate court-ordered freeze pending the outcome of federal review and any subsequent forfeit proceedings. Silence spread across the room the way cold spreads from an open window, slowly, then all at once. Sloane unfolded her arms. Harlan's voice, when it returned, had a new texture. Still controlled but working harder at it. "That clause," he said, "was drafted as a mutual protection measure. It applies to both parties equally." "It does," I agreed. "Your attorneys wrote it. You signed it on the 14th of March 2 years ago. I have the notarized copy." "Then you understand," he said, recovering now, recalibrating that the clause activates only upon conviction, which requires evidence, a trial, a verdict. He allowed himself a small, cold smile. "That takes time. Considerably more time than you have available tonight." "You might be right," I said. "I know I am." He straightened. "You are my wife, Vivienne. For the next several hours. You carry trays and you smile. And then you sign what I've put in front of you. Or I make the next 18 months of your life a financial and legal catastrophe. Those are the options." He pushed the divorce agreement 6 in closer across the desk. I looked at the document. I looked at Harren. I looked at the diamond on my left hand just for a moment. Just long enough. Then I looked back at him. "Sign whatever you want, Harren." I said, "It won't matter after tonight." The smile stayed on his face for approximately 3 seconds. Then it didn't. He stood, not the measured rise of a man in control, but something faster. Something that had slipped its leash. He came around the side of the desk. And for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I saw the thing he usually kept behind 3 layers of tailoring and rehearsed composure. He stopped 2 feet from me. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to a register that didn't reach Sloane in the corner. Low and deliberate. Each word chosen for maximum precision. Aimed at the specific coordinates of what he believed was my weakest point. He told me exactly what he intended to do. Not a threat dressed in corporate language. The real version. I heard every word. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I held his gaze for 4 seconds, then turned and walked toward the door. The diamond on my finger caught the amber light as I reached for the handle. It had heard every word, too. What Harlan said to me in that room. I won't repeat it here. But the ring on my finger recorded every word. And that is all that needs to be said. I walked out of his study and pulled the door closed behind me with the quiet, deliberate click of someone who had nothing left to prove in that room. The hallway on the 2nd floor stretched in both directions. Amber sconces at even intervals. A Persian runner down the center. The kind of corridor that had been designed to feel significant. Below, the party continued its performance. The murmur of 200 voices. The jazz quartet cycling back to a standard it had already played once. The occasional percussion of laughter that traveled upward through the floors like something looking for a way out. I did not hurry. Harren believed I was walking away defeated. I had spent 5 years studying the architecture of his assumptions. And I knew exactly which ones to leave undisturbed. The most dangerous thing I could do right now was move like a woman who had somewhere urgent to be. So I moved like a woman with nowhere to be at all, measured steps. Shoulders level. The expression of someone returning from a conversation that had gone exactly as expected. Which in every way that mattered. It had. Halfway down the corridor, a server rounded the corner carrying an empty champagne tray. Dana Marsh. 32. Dark hair pulled back beneath a white catering cap. Moving with the slightly too efficient gait of someone whose real training had nothing to do with food service. We passed each other without breaking stride. Her left hand, as it swung at her side, extended 2 fingers, then folded them flat. Perimeter secure. Devices active. My right hand, carrying nothing, dropped a single finger downward. Confirmed. The entire exchange lasted for seconds. Neither of us made eye contact. By the time Dana turned the corner toward the east wing, I had already reached the top of the staircase. For seconds was all we needed. For seconds was all we ever used. That was the discipline of it. The understanding that efficiency and invisibility are the same thing when you are working a room that does not know it is being worked. I stopped at the landing below me and to the left. A door stood half open to what the household staff called the storage corridor, a narrow service passage that connected the catering station to the rear utility rooms. Through the gap, I could see Derek Holloway. He was alone. He stood at a stainless steel shelving unit, his back partially turned to the door, his attention fixed on a black leather briefcase on the shelf in front of him. He was not opening it. He was not checking its contents. He was simply standing there with one hand resting on the clasp, the way a person stands in front of something they have carried a long time and are almost ready to set down. His shoulders held a stillness that was different from calm. The stillness of someone who has been rehearsing a moment for so long that when it finally arrives, the body doesn't know whether to move or simply stay exactly where it is. I watched him for 3 seconds. Then I looked away and continued down the stairs. I had first met Derek Holloway 18 months ago, though he didn't know it was a meeting. It began as a file, a name in a secondary contact list attached to a Western global financial audit flagged not for what it contained, but for what was conspicuously absent. Derek had been Harlan's executive assistant for 4 years. He had access to every document that passed through that office, and yet in 4 years his name appeared nowhere in the financial irregularity trail. Not because he was innocent, because he was careful. We approached him on a Tuesday afternoon in a parking structure in Culver City, my supervisor and I. No badges visible, no marked vehicle. Derek had listened to the entire briefing without interrupting the loan network, the laundering conduit, the sealed indictments in progress. When we finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not uncertainty. The kind that belongs to someone who already knows what they are going to say and is simply deciding how much of themselves to show in the saying of it. Then he asked one question. Will it be enough to bring him down, all of it? I looked at him directly. Every charge. He nodded once. He didn't ask for witness protection. He didn't ask for a deal. He didn't ask what happened to people who cooperated and found themselves exposed when the operation moved slower than expected. He asked for 18 months to get into position. We gave him 16. By the time I reached the main hall, the room had shifted. The cocktail configuration had given way to something more formal. Guests arranged in a loose semicircle around a raised platform near the north wall where a polished walnut podium stood under a single spotlight. 200 people, glasses and hand faces, turned forward, wearing the attentive expressions of people who had been expecting this moment. Harlan was already at the podium. He had his jacket back on. The sleeves were down. The composure was immaculate. Not a trace of the man who had dropped his voice to a threat in a private office 15 minutes ago. He moved through the opening of his prepared remarks with the ease of someone who had been performing versions of this speech for a decade. Confident, measured, fluent in the specific dialect of men who have confused their net worth with their character. I took a position near the service station to the left of the room, close enough to watch, far enough to remain furniture. 10 years ago, Harlan said, his voice carrying cleanly across the hall. I started this company with a single belief that the right vision applied with enough discipline could build something that lasts. Applause measured, sincere from some, reflexive from others. He paused, let it settle, then smiled. The public version. The one calibrated for rooms exactly like this one. I also chose somewhere in that decade. He continued, his gaze finding me across the hall with the accuracy of someone who had practiced this particular look. The most beautiful woman in any room I've ever walked into. A choice I made entirely with my eyes. He lifted his glass slightly in my direction rather than my head. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Warm. Appreciative. The sound of people who found the joke charming because they did not know the man who made it. I smiled. It was the most precisely constructed smile of the evening. And while the room laughed, the ring on my left hand continued doing the only thing that mattered. Recording every word he said in the voice he used when he thought he was safe. The applause that followed Harlan's opening remarks was still settling when the main entrance doors opened. 2 men entered. The first was in his mid-30s. Tall, slightly underdressed for the room, wearing a dark blazer over a plain white shirt, the kind of outfit assembled by someone who had dressed for a different kind of evening than this one. He scanned the room with the cautious alertness of a person who does not entirely want to be here. Marcus Pennington. The second man moved differently. Older perhaps. Mid-60s. Silver-haired. Wearing a charcoal suit with the quiet authority of someone who had never once needed a spotlight to command a room's attention. He entered without announcement. Without urgency. Without the social performance of a late arrival. Apologizing for itself. Arthur Pennington. He paused just inside the doorway. His gaze moved across the room the way experienced eyes move. Not searching exactly, but cataloguing the guests near the entrance. The staff at the service stations. The podium. The corners. Then it stopped. It stopped at me. He looked at me for a moment that lasted longer than coincidence allows. Long enough for me to understand that the pause was deliberate. That the recognition behind it was complete. And that Arthur Pennington had walked into this room tonight knowing exactly who was standing beside the service station. The question was what he intended to do about it. I needed air. Or more precisely, I needed to reach the place where I knew she was already waiting. The rear garden of the Western estate was separated from the main hall by a set of French doors that the catering staff had propped open since 7 o'clock to allow circulation. Beyond them, a stone terrace gave way to a landscaped garden. Italian cypress trees. In a straight line along the far wall. A low hedge border. A decorative fountain that had been turned off for the evening. The lights from the main hall reached only the first 10 feet of terrace before the darkness took over. Margaret Weston was standing at the edge of that darkness. She had positioned herself beside the row of cypress trees at the garden's far boundary. Far enough from the French doors that the noise from inside arrived muffled. Far enough from the terrace lights that anyone glancing out would see only a shape. She was holding a glass of white wine. She had not touched it. I could tell by the way condensation had gathered at the base. The glass had been in her hand long enough to warm slightly, but not long enough to drink. I crossed the terrace and walked toward her without hurrying. She did not turn until I was close enough that turning was simply an acknowledgement rather than a reaction. For a moment, neither of us spoke. In 5 years of living in the same household, holidays, dinners, the choreographed performances of a family presenting itself to the world, Margaret Weston and I had never once stood together like this. Without Harland between us. Without Sloane in the peripheral frame. Without the architecture of the family's social performance requiring us to occupy our assigned positions. She looked older than she did in the main hall. Not in a diminished way, in the way that people look when they have set down something heavy and their face is finally allowed to show the years it took to carry it. You watched me in there, I said quietly in the main hall during his speech. I've been watching you all evening, she said. Her voice was low, unhurried. The diction of a woman who had spent decades choosing her words carefully in rooms where carelessness had consequences. I wanted to make sure you were still steady. I'm steady. I know. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had no prior reference for. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition. Perhaps the specific recognition of two people who have been carrying the same weight from opposite sides. That's why I'm here. She set the wine glass down on the flat top of the hedge beside her. Then she opened the small evening bag on her wrist. Black satin. Understated. The kind of bag that held only essentials and withdrew a USB drive. Matte black. No larger than a thumb joint. She placed it in my palm without ceremony. The final file. She said. Everything you need for the board meeting documentation. The October session. The February session. And the one they never formally logged. The one in December where he restructured the loan distribution to move liability off Western Global's books. I closed my fingers around the drive. The December meeting. I said. We had a gap in the record. I know you did. She folded her hands in front of her. I was in the room. I had told myself in the early months of this operation that Margaret's coldness was simply who she was. The composed, untouchable matriarch of a wealthy family. Indifferent to the woman her son had married. I had filed her behavior as background noise. A variable that didn't affect the investigation's primary trajectory. I was wrong about that. 5 years ago. 3 months before Harlan and I were married. Before the IRS file on Western Global had a cover page. Margaret Weston had walked into the federal building on Wilshire Boulevard on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with someone in criminal investigation. Not because we approached her. Because she came first. The agent who took her initial statement had flagged it as a potential credibility concern. A wealthy woman making allegations about her own son with no documentation and no clear motive beyond what she described as watching someone I raised become someone I don't recognize. The file sat in a secondary review queue for 6 weeks before it landed on my supervisor's desk. 2 weeks before my own assignment to the Western Global case. By then Margaret had already begun. She had spent 5 years maintaining a performance so complete that Harlan had never once considered her a variable. She had been cold to me in every room where he could see. Distant at every dinner where he was present, critical in the careful, oblique way of a mother-in-law whose disapproval never quite rose to the level of confrontation. She had given Harlan exactly what he expected from her and used every moment of his certainty as cover. The price she paid for that cover was standing 10 feet from me at 30 social occasions over 5 years and never once allowing herself to show what she actually knew. I looked at the USB drive in my hand. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I asked that it was you who came forward first. Margaret was quiet for a moment because it wasn't relevant to your work. She said finally, and because the moment you started thinking of me as an ally rather than a threat, your behavior would have changed marginally, but Harren would have noticed marginally. She picked up her wine glass, looked at it briefly, then set it back down. End it, she said. Not urgency, not emotion, just the quiet, final instruction of someone who has been waiting a very long time to say 2 words. End it tonight. She turned and walked back toward the French doors with the unhurried composure of a woman returning from a moment of fresh air at a party she had attended many times before. I watched her go. I stood in the garden for approximately 30 seconds after she disappeared inside. In 5 years of this investigation, there had been moments of doubt. Not about the case, but about the cost of it. The things that get hollowed out when you live inside a cover long enough. The question of what remains when the operation ends and the performance stops. Standing in that garden holding a USB drive that a 63-year-old woman had been quietly building toward for half a decade. I understood something I had not let myself understand before. I had not been alone in this. I had never been alone in this. The thought lasted exactly as long as I allowed it to. Then I closed my fingers tighter around the drive, turned toward the terrace, and reached into my jacket for my secondary phone. Cole's message was already there waiting. H is moving. He's made contact with D. It's time. 3 sentences. 11 words. Harren was looking for Derek. The escape plan had started. The IRS criminal investigation badge caught the light the way gold catches light, completely without apology. And in that single moment, everything that had happened in this house over the past 3 hours rearranged itself into its actual shape. I held it open long enough for the room to see it. Not for theater. Because 200 people deserved to know what they had been standing inside without knowing it. Then I looked at Arthur Pennington. Authorization confirmed. I said, Operation Pinnacle is fully active. All secondary units are in position. We're clear to proceed. Arthur nodded once, the nod of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific sentence and is satisfied to finally hear it spoken in the right room. I turned to face the hall. 200 people. Every one of them motionless. The amber light overhead designed for celebration now fell across a room that had become something else entirely. A federal operation in its final phase, wearing the clothes of an anniversary gala like a second skin it was finally allowed to shed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. For months ago, I said the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, in coordination with the Department of Justice and a cooperating federal witness, authorized a sting operation targeting the financial operations of Western Global and its CEO Harlan Weston. The silence in the room had texture now. It was not the silence of people who did not understand. It was the silence of people who were understanding too much at once. Tonight's event, the 10-year anniversary gala of Western Global, was selected as the operational venue based on 3 criteria. First, it provided a controlled environment with a defined guest list, manageable entry points, and a predictable social structure. Second, it guaranteed the presence of the primary target in a setting where his behavior pattern was known and consistent. Third, I paused. Not for effect, but because the third reason mattered more than the first two combined. It was the setting he had already chosen for his own exit plan. We simply made sure the exit he'd arranged led somewhere he didn't expect. I watched Harlan while I spoke. He was standing 8 feet to my left, Cole's hand on his arm, wearing an expression I had no prior reference for in 5 years of studying his face. It was not anger. It was not the cold composure of the study or the performance-grade smile of the lobby. It was something underneath all of those. The expression of a man watching the architecture of his own careful construction come down around him in a room full of people he had spent a decade impressing. The catering staff shortage you may have noticed this evening, I continued, was deliberate. 11 of the 12 contracted servers were replaced with federal agents and IRS criminal investigation personnel. Cole Briggs and Dana Marsh, who some of you may have seen working the service stations tonight, are senior agents who have been embedded in this operation for 4 months. Somewhere in the crowd, I heard a single sharp intake of breath. The diamond ring that Harlan Weston presented to me on our 4th wedding anniversary contained a military recording device operating on dual frequencies. He placed it there to monitor my movements. I discovered it 6 months ago during a routine RF sweep. I continued wearing it. Every conversation Harran has had in my presence since that discovery is on the federal record. I looked at Harran when I said the next part, including the conversation in his private study at 8:50 this evening. His jaw tightened by a fraction that only someone who had spent 5 years watching his face would notice. Derek Holloway, Harlan's executive assistant, has been cooperating with this investigation for 18 months. The briefcase Harlan retrieved from Mr. Holloway tonight did not contain what he believed it contained. It contained the arrest documentation you are about to see executed. The charges against Harran Weston are as follows. I did not read from a document. I had memoized them. Large-scale money laundering in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1956 involving the processing of no less than $31 million through a network of shell entities connected to Pinnacle Capital over a period of 14 months. Wire fraud in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, including the fraudulent structuring of Western Global's loan liabilities to conceal insolvency from investors and financial partners. Aggravated identity theft in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 128A, specifically the use of a federal agent's personal credit identity to secure a $2.5 million loan from a lender under active federal investigation and interference with a federal officer in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 111 arising from actions taken with knowledge that the affected party was a credentialed agent of the United States government. The room received each charge the way a room receives something it cannot put back once it has heard it. Not with noise. With weight. Harlan moved. Not toward the exit. Cole's position made that irrelevant. Not toward me. He turned slightly. The way a man turns when he is looking for the last possible variable in a problem. He has already lost. And his eyes found Arthur Pennington. Arthur. His voice had lost every layer of production. What remained was something stripped, unmanufactured. The voice of a man who was no longer performing. We had an arrangement. You were. I was a cooperating federal witness. Arthur said his voice was even, not cruel, simply precise. I have been since March of last year. My testimony regarding the Pinnacle Capital board meetings is part of the sealed indictment. I'm sorry, Harran. I'm not who you needed me to be tonight. Harlan looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at me. And I looked back at him for the first time all evening without anything between us. No tray. No apron. No performance. Number 5 years of careful, necessary silence. Just the facts of what had happened and the room we were both standing in when they finally became visible. He had nothing left to say. For the first time since I had known Harran Weston. He simply had nothing. Cole stepped forward. Dana moved to his left, completing the bracket. Harran Weston. Cole said, "You are under arrest." The handcuffs closed with a sound that traveled to every corner of the room in the Beverly Hills mansion that Harlan had built his identity inside the marble floors. The amber lights. The jazz quartet that had long since put down its instruments. The sound of those handcuffs was the loudest thing that had happened all night. The controlled chaos that followed had its own specific texture, agents moving through the crowd with the efficient choreography of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed more times than tonight required guests clustering in small groups with the instinct of people who need to process something in proximity to other people who witnessed the same thing. I turned toward the south wall. Sloane was standing near the entrance archway. Not pressed against it anymore, but searching. Her eyes were moving through the crowd with a specific focused urgency that I recognized as someone looking for one person in particular. She was looking for Arthur Pennington. I watched her face as she searched. Gone was the woman who had stood in a private study with her arms folded and watched her brother threaten his wife. Gone was the woman who had called me a dated decoration in front of 50 people with the comfortable ease of someone who has never once questioned the ground beneath her. What was left on Sloane Weston's face in that moment was something I had not seen there in 5 years. Not arrogance. Not the controlled contempt she wore like a second outfit. Panic. The specific structureless panic of a person who has just understood that every certainty they built their life on was constructed on the assumption that certain things would always hold, and those things have just in the span of one evening stopped holding entirely. She hadn't found Arthur yet. But I already knew what Arthur was going to tell her when she did. While agents began securing documents and guests were directed toward the main exit, Sloane found Arthur Pennington, and I was standing close enough to hear. The reception room off the main hall had become a staging area in the last 15 minutes. 2 agents at the writing desk in the corner. A third working through a filing cabinet that had been unlocked with a warrant key. The contents being catalogued with the methodical efficiency of people who have done this many times and understand that the quality of this work determines what happens in a courtroom 18 months from now. The party's catering infrastructure. The tablecloths. The flower arrangements. The champagne towers that no one had touched in the last hour stood around them like props from a production that had closed mid-performance. Sloane had found Arthur near the far window. She was still in the backless dress. Still composed. Technically, her posture was correct. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled. But the composition was the kind that exists in the 30 seconds before something gives way entirely. I recognized it the way you recognize weather. Mr. Pennington. She kept her voice low. I understand tonight has been, I understand what's happened. But Marcus and I, what we have is separate from all of this. Whatever Harlan arranged. Whatever he put in those documents, that's not who Marcus and I are to each other. If you could just speak with him. Arthur looked at her. It was not a cruel look. It was something more precise than cruelty. The look of a man who has decided that the kindest thing available is accuracy delivered without delay. Miss Weston, he said, Marcus has been disinherited for 7 years. Sloane stopped speaking. He made a series of significant financial errors in his late 20s. The specifics are his to share if he chooses to. When it became clear to me that the pattern was not correcting itself, I made a decision that I believed was in his long-term interest. Arthur's voice did not change register. I repaid the affected parties from my own assets. Marcus completed an 18-month rehabilitation program. He has not touched the family trust since. He will not touch it in the future. Sloane's lips parted slightly. He currently holds a lecture position at UCLA. Arthur continued. Behavioral finance. His annual salary is $87,000. He drives a 2019 Honda Civic. He lives in Culver City. A pause. He is by every measure that I consider meaningful. A better man than he was at 28. But he is not the man you appear to have been expecting. The room around them continued its work. Agents moved. Documents were stacked. A radio crackled briefly near the doorway and went quiet. Sloane stood very still. I had watched Sloane Weston operate in social situations for 5 years. Had watched her read a room in under 4 seconds. Recalibrate her approach in under 2. Deploy exactly the right register of charm or pressure or contempt for whatever the moment required. She was whatever else, she was exceptionally good at adaptation. She had no adaptation available for this. 7 years, she said the words came out with the particular flatness of someone doing arithmetic they don't want to finish. Yes. He never said no. Arthur agreed. He wouldn't have. Marcus doesn't lead with what he doesn't have. It's one of the things the last 7 years taught him. He looked at her with an expression that was not without sympathy, but did not let sympathy interfere with clarity. I don't say this to be unkind, Miss Weston. I say it because I think you deserve to have complete information before you make decisions about what comes next. I became aware of Marcus before Sloane did. He had come to stand at the edge of the reception room doorway. Not entering exactly, but present. He was still in the dark blazer and plain white shirt he had worn into the estate 2 hours ago. Still slightly underdressed for the room. Though that distinction had ceased to matter some time ago. He had the expression of a man who has heard enough to understand the complete shape of what he heard, and has had approximately 90 seconds to decide what to do with that understanding. He was not angry. That was the thing that stayed with me. Standing in that room, watching him watch Sloane while Sloane was still watching his father. He was not angry. There was no betrayal in his face. No. The specific outrage of a person who has been used. What he carried instead was something quieter and in some ways harder to look at. He was simply sad. Marcus stepped into the room. Sloane turned when she heard his footstep. They looked at each other across 12 feet of reception room floor in a house that was being systematically taken apart by federal agents around them. And neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted long enough to constitute its own kind of conversation. Then Marcus reached into the breast pocket of his blazer. He removed the engagement ring. A 2-carat cushion cut set in platinum. The kind of ring selected by someone who had been told to select something that would impress. And placed it on the corner of the writing desk beside him. Gently, without drama. The way you set down something that was never entirely yours to carry. He looked at Sloane for one more second. Then he turned and walked out of the reception room. Sloane did not follow. She stood where she was. Her eyes on the ring. On the desk. Her hands at her sides. The room continued to function around her agent's documents. The quiet machinery of federal consequence. And she stood in the middle of it. The way a person stands when the ground has shifted. And they have not yet determined where it is safe to step. I had expected when this moment came to feel something adjacent to satisfaction. 5 years is a long time to carry what I had carried. And Sloane had contributed to the weight of it in ways that were specific and deliberate. What I felt instead was something I had not prepared for. It moved through me before I could categorize it something adjacent to pity. Though not quite that. Something closer to the recognition of what greed costs when the bill finally arrives. Sloane had not manufactured her brother's crimes. She had simply built her life on the assumption that his architecture would hold. And now she was standing in the wreckage of that assumption. Wearing a dress she had chosen to impress a billionaire who earned $87,000 a year. No one needed to do anything more to Sloane Weston tonight. She had already arrived at the consequence that fit. My secondary phone vibrated twice in my jacket pocket. I stepped back from the doorway and checked the screen. The message was from headquarters. 3 lines. Western Global Asset Freeze Order executed 22/17. All accounts suspended pending forfeit review. Prenuptial clause triggered per arrest documentation. Secondary action required before site clearance. I read it twice. The prenuptial clause had activated at the moment of Harlan's formal arrest. Not conviction, but arrest. Because that was how the clause had been drafted. Harlan's attorney had reviewed it and approved it 2 years ago without registering the specific trigger language. He had been thorough about many things. He had not been thorough about that. I put the phone away. There was one more thing I needed to do before I left this house tonight. When the last guest had been directed out, and the jazz quartet's music had long since gone quiet, I stood alone in the center of the main hall. And for the first time all evening, the room had nothing left to perform. The amber lights were dim to their lowest setting. The flower arrangements had begun releasing their formal shapes. Not wilted, but no longer trying. Champagne flutes stood at half measure across 6 tables abandoned mid-thought by people who had stopped thinking about champagne 90 minutes ago. The jazz quartet's chairs stood empty. Sheet music still on the stands, waiting for musicians who were not coming back. I let myself look at the room for 20 seconds. Not cataloguing. Just looking the way you look at something you know you will not see again and want to carry the accurate version with you rather than what memory manufactures over time. Then I reached into my jacket and took out the ring. 2 carats emerald cut platinum setting. A military transmitter hidden beneath the stone that had recorded 412 hours of audio over 6 months. It had done everything it was designed to do. And one thing it wasn't. It had recorded a marriage ending in real time. One conversation at a time. Until there was nothing left to record. I set it on the nearest table. Beside it, I placed a cream-colored envelope. Harlan Weston's full legal name in my handwriting across the front. Inside, a divorce petition signed and notarized 3 months ago by a family law attorney in Pasadena who had asked only one question. When do you want to file? And had accepted my answer without comment. California requires no agreement from the other party. No signature. No consent. No presence. The filing would proceed regardless of where Harlan spent the next several decades. His attorneys would receive the paperwork in the morning. The ring and the envelope could stay on this table for whoever was responsible for closing up the house. Neither of them had anywhere else to be. I stepped back. Derek Holloway was standing at the side entrance. Still in the server's jacket. Holding it closed at the front with one hand not buttoned. The way you hold something when you're almost ready to take it off for the last time. But haven't quite reached the door. Derek, I said. He looked up. I want to tell you about Nathan Holloway because Derek never would. Nathan was 31 when he died. A fund administrator in Phoenix. Careful. Honest, the kind of person who believed the system he worked inside would hold. He had trusted a Western global investment vehicle with $400,000 of client funds. The vehicle was structured to generate short-term returns while moving principal through a layered shell network. By the time Nathan understood what he was looking at, the money was in its 3rd jurisdiction. And his professional liability was absolute. 8 months of trying to find a path through it. Legal consultations he couldn't afford. Regulatory filings that disappeared into queues. Letters to Western Global's investor relations department that returned responses carefully engineered to contain nothing actionable. A credit card 4 days from its limit. A hotel room in Phoenix checked under his own name. It was 4 days before anyone came to the door. Derek drove from Los Angeles to Phoenix on a Saturday because Nathan wasn't answering his phone. And Derek knew his brother well enough to understand what that silence meant. He sat in the parking lot outside the medical examiner's office for 2 hours before he went inside. 3 weeks later, he submitted a resume to Western Global's executive staffing agency. He waited 3 years for tonight. I looked at him across the empty hall. 20 feet of silence between us. The dimmed amber light. The room that had held everything that happened here. And I thought about what 3 years costs when you are paying in that particular currency in daily proximity to the man responsible in the discipline of performing loyalty to someone you hold accountable for the worst morning of your life. I nodded. He nodded back. No words. Nothing that needed to be said that hadn't already been said by a handwritten index card at the bottom of a briefcase. Just 2 people who had carried different weights toward the same outcome and the small sufficient recognition of that in each other. He pushed open the side door and walked out. I stood alone for a moment longer and let the accounting settle. Harlan was in a federal vehicle heading toward processing 4 charges. No bail eligibility on the Section 111 count. Attorneys who would file motions in the morning that would not change the weight of what the prosecution was carrying into a courtroom. Western Global's accounts had frozen at 10:17 p.m. The board would convene within 48 hours and discover that a decade of institutional trust had been placed in a man running a parallel financial operation $31 million deep. Sloan had left 20 minutes ago in a car she called herself. No conversation on the way out. The engagement ring she left on the writing desk in the reception room was now in an evidence bag alongside the one Marcus had placed beside it. Marcus had walked out the front entrance at 10:22, gotten into a 2019 Honda Civic parked on the street and driven away without looking back. I did not know where he was going. I thought it was probably somewhere quiet. And that quiet was probably what he needed. Margaret had been escorted to a secure location at 9:50 before the public arrest. Before the hall cleared. before anyone had the opportunity to connect her presence to anything except a mother attending her son's party. Full immunity. Relocation assistance offered. She had declined the relocation. She had asked only that her forwarding address not be shared with anyone connected to Western Global. I had made sure of it personally. I thought about her standing at the edge of the garden with an untouched glass of wine. End it. She had been ending it in her own way for 5 years before I arrived. I put on my jacket, walked to the front entrance, and stepped out into the Beverly Hills night. The circular drive was empty. The hedge border immaculate. The city beyond the estate's gates continued at its own pace, indifferent to what had occurred inside the walls that contained it. The way cities always are, which is either cruel or honest, depending on what you need from the world on a given evening. I did not look back at the building. Some things you don't need to see from the outside to understand what they were. 6 months later, I was at my desk on the 14th floor of a federal building in downtown Los Angeles. A corner office with a view. I was still deciding what I thought about when my phone lit up with a message from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words. I read them once, set the phone face down, looked at the city for a long moment. Then I picked it back up. 6 months is enough time for justice to finish its paperwork and enough time to understand that the night in Beverly Hills was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. The office on the 14th floor of the federal building on Pennsylvania Avenue faced east, which meant that on clear mornings the light came in at an angle that made the city look considered rather than constructed. It was a corner office. I had not asked for it. My supervisor had told me when she handed me the assignment paperwork that it came with the position and that I should resist the urge to feel uncomfortable about the view. I was still working on that. March in Washington, D.C. carried a different quality than March in Los Angeles. Colder, more deliberate. A city that had been built to mean something and had spent 2 centuries deciding whether it had succeeded. I had been here for months. I had learned which coffee was worth walking for and which was not, which metro line ran on time and which required contingency planning, and that the 14th floor had a draft in the northeast corner that no one had ever successfully addressed. I had learned that the work here was the same work. Different desk. Same weight. The Harland Weston case closed on February 11, 2025. 23 years federal custody. No parole eligibility for the first 15. The sentencing judge cited the deliberate targeting of federal infrastructure, the sustained nature of the financial fraud, and the specific cruelty of using a federal agent's personal identity as an instrument of the crime. Harland's defense team had filed 4 motions to suppress and 2 requests for continuance. None of them had changed the weight of what the prosecution carried into that courtroom. Western Global was formally dissolved on the same day. Its remaining assets after forfeit proceedings, creditor claims, and the cost of the federal investigation itself amounted to less than 4% of the company's stated valuation 18 months prior. The board members, who had not been implicated in the financial irregularities, were left to explain to their own attorneys how a decade of oversight had failed to surface a $31 million discrepancy. I had not watched the sentencing. I had read the summary in a case closure report, signed the acknowledgement, and filed it. Some endings don't require a witness. They just require completion. Sloane Weston was not charged. The evidence did not support it. She had been a planned instrument of her brother's arrangement, not a participant in it. And the distinction mattered under the law, even when it felt insufficient in other ways. She was 29 years old and had spent the 6 months since the arrest rebuilding a life that had been constructed on foundations she had not known were borrowed. I did not know the specifics of what that rebuilding looked like. I did not need to. The law had given her what it could give her: her freedom and the truth about how she had nearly lost it. And the rest was hers to carry. Margaret Weston had settled in a small town in Vermont, a place with a name I knew and had no reason to write down here. She had declined the formal relocation assistance, but had accepted a new identity document under her maiden name, which she had quietly requested through her immunity agreement's provisions. She was by all accounts unreachable by anyone connected to the world. She had spent 5 years carefully dismantling from the inside. I thought about her occasionally. Not often, but occasionally. Derek Holloway had been offered a financial cooperation award consistent with IRS whistleblower provisions. A percentage of the recovered assets that would have amounted to a figure with 6 zeros. He had declined it in writing in a letter that was 3 sentences long and did not explain itself. What he had asked for instead was a letter of formal recognition from the IRS confirming his cooperation addressed to no one in particular that he could keep and a contact at the Phoenix City permitting office who could tell him what was required to place a small memorial marker at a specific location. A hotel on East Van Buren Street near the room where his brother had spent the last 4 days of his life. The marker had been placed in January. I had seen the photograph Derek sent to the case coordinator. It was a small bronze plaque affixed to a low stone near the hotel's east entrance. It had Nathan's full name, his birth year, his death year, and a single line beneath. He was honest. And it cost him everything. That has been corrected. I had read that line 3 times before I put the photograph away. Marcus Pennington was teaching a Tuesday-Thursday section on behavioral finance at UCLA. His student evaluations for the fall semester had placed him in the top 12% of the department. He drove the same Honda Civic. He had not contacted his father since the night of the gala, which Arthur Pennington had mentioned in a follow-up deposition with the tone of a man who considered the distance to be appropriate and possibly deserved. In the second week of March, a text message had arrived on my personal phone from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words. Thank you, Vivian. I had set the phone face down on my desk and looked at the city for a long moment. Then I had picked it back up and saved the number under a name I did not write down here either. Because some things belong to the person who said them and the person who received them and no one else. I had no wedding ring on my left hand. The divorce had been finalized in November uncontested because Harron had no viable legal standing from which to contest it. And his attorneys had more significant problems to manage. The paperwork had moved through the California family court system with the quiet efficiency of something that had been prepared correctly and simply needed to be processed. I did not miss the ring. I had not expected to. And I did not. What I had not expected was how much lighter the left hand felt. Not empty. Not diminished. But free of a specific weight that I had grown so accustomed to carrying that I had stopped noticing it was there. The new file had been on my desk since 8 o'clock that morning. A name I did not yet know well enough to carry. A network that had been operating quietly for 3 years in 4 states. Leaving the kind of evidence trail that looks like noise until you know what pattern to look for. A case that would require patience, precision, and the particular discipline of someone who understands that the work does not end. It only moves to the next room. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked out the window at the city in the March light. Deliberate and grey and entirely indifferent to what I was about to do next. Then I opened the file. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. Not the 5 years undercover. Not the ring. Not standing in that hall watching 200 people realize the woman who had been carrying their champagne all evening was the one who had built the entire case against their host. The hardest part was the silence. The years of knowing what was right and having to wait for the moment when right could finally be spoken out loud. I am not a perfect person and this is not a perfect story. I stayed longer than I should have. I let the mission consume everything else. If you are watching your own life move in a direction that doesn't feel like yours, don't do what I did. Don't wait for someone else's plan to collapse before you decide to stand up. You are allowed to stand up first. You are allowed to choose yourself before the evidence is complete. I believe in something larger than courtrooms and indictments. I have seen enough family betrayal to know that it hollows out the people who commit it long before it destroys anyone else. I have seen enough family revenge to know it never looks from the inside the way it looks from the outside. And I genuinely believe that God does not lose paperwork. Every family betrayal made in the dark finds the light eventually. Every act of family revenge extracts its real cost from the person who chose it. Every arrangement built on someone else's silence eventually runs out of silence to borrow. I am not telling you justice always wins. I am telling you it is still worth working for. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me which moment hit the hardest. Tell me what you would have done differently than I did. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that family revenge is not a solution. It is a cost. And if you haven't yet, Subscribe because the next file is already on my desk and I intend to open it. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. A note before you go. The stories ahead contain fictional elements constructed with care and with purpose. If that is not the kind of content that serves you, there is no obligation to stay. Find what speaks to you and go there without apology. For everyone else, I will see you in the next one. I set the tray down on the catering counter and walked toward him. Not quickly. Not with any particular purpose that anyone watching would have been able to name. Just a woman in a simple dress moving through a crowded corridor the way people do when they need a moment away from a room that expects too much of them. The service hallway ran along the east side of the estate, narrower than the main hall, lit with recessed fixtures that gave everything a slightly amber cast. The noise from the party filtered through as a low continuous hum. Out here, the air smelled less like flowers and more like whatever the kitchen was producing for the second course. I was 3 feet away when the man in the catering uniform turned slightly, and I let my shoulder catch the edge of his tray. 2 glasses shifted. Neither fell. He studied them with the practiced ease of someone who had done far more complicated things than catch glass here. "Excuse me," I said. "My fault entirely." His voice was low, unhurried. He did not look directly at me. His eyes stayed on the tray while his hands made a small adjustment to the positioning of the glasses. "Staffing's thin tonight. Hard to move without bumping into someone. Cole Briggs, 38 years old. 11 years with the agency before transferring to my division 4 years ago. He had a talent for disappearing into whatever room he was in. Not because he was forgettable, but because he understood instinctively how to make himself look like he belonged. The second course is running about 6 minutes behind," he said, still not looking at me, already beginning to move away. "Kitchen's backed up." 6 minutes. That was not about food. It meant the technical setup in the study on the second floor. The one we had positioned 3 weeks ago during a site visit I had attended as Harlan's wife. Picking out centerpiece options was running 6 minutes behind schedule. "Equipment check, not catering timeline." "Thank you," I said and kept walking. I came back into the main hall through the side entrance and paused near the edge of the room, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness after the corridor's dimmer light. Harlan was across the room, deep in conversation with a man I recognized as a regional director for one of Western Global's European distribution partners. Standard anniversary party business. Nothing I needed to monitor yet. What I did need to monitor was standing approximately 8 foot behind Harlan's left shoulder. Derek Holloway had been Harlan's executive assistant for 3 years. On paper, he managed Harlan's calendar, coordinated with department heads, and handled the logistical architecture of a CEO's daily life. In practice, he was the person Harlan trusted with things that did not appear on any official calendar. He was 35, lean, with close-cropped dark hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that the most useful thing you could be in a room was invisible. He was good at his job. I had watched him work for nearly 2 years, and I had never once seen him fumble overreach or show anything on his face that he had not decided to show. Tonight he stood at the precise distance from Harlan that said, "I am available," without saying, "I am listening," close enough to be summoned, far enough back to be overlooked. His expression was neutral, professional, completely controlled, except for one thing. His hands. His right hand was loose at his side, which was normal, but his left hand, partially obscured by the angle of his body, had the very faint tension of someone gripping something. They were trying not to grip a stillness that was slightly too deliberate, like a man holding himself carefully in place. I had seen that particular stillness before, usually in people who were waiting for something specific to happen. I filed it away and shifted my attention to the far side of the room, near the entrance to the rear terrace. Sloane was doing what Sloane did best at these events: positioning. She had her hand lightly on the arm of a man I recognized immediately, Marcus Pennington. She was steering him toward a cluster of guests near the terrace doors with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been managing social navigation since childhood. Marcus was going along with it physically at least, but there was something in the way he moved that did not quite match the room. Everyone else at a Western Global Anniversary Gala moved with a certain performative ease. The practiced looseness of people who had been attending events like this long enough to wear them like a second skin. Marcus moved like a man who was present but not invested. He listened when people spoke to him. He responded appropriately. But his eyes, when they were not required to be anywhere specific, kept drifting not restlessly, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone genuinely curious about what was actually happening around him rather than what was supposed to be happening. That was unusual in this room. I was still watching him when I felt it. The particular awareness of being observed. I turned my head slightly. Margaret Weston was standing near the base of the main staircase. A glass of white wine in her hand. The same one she had been holding untouched since I first noticed her an hour ago. She was looking directly at me. For a moment. Just a moment. Neither of us moved. Then her gaze traveled past me deliberately like I was a piece of furniture she had momentarily mistaken for something worth noticing. She turned slightly and began a conversation with the woman beside her. Her expression settling back into its default configuration of composed, faintly imperious and entirely closed. Same as every event. Same as every dinner. Same as 5 years of standing in the same rooms and looking through me like I was made of glass. I turned back toward the main floor and that was when Derek Holloway's eyes found mine. It lasted 1 second. Maybe less. He was scanning the room in the way that assistants do cataloging. Assessing, staying ahead of whatever his employer might need next. His gaze passed across the crowd in a smooth, professional arc. And for 1 fraction of a second it landed on me. Then it moved on. No pause. No acknowledgement. Just a clean, unbroken sweep that continued past me like I had not registered at all. But in that single second, I had seen something. Not recognition exactly. Not alarm. Something quieter than both, a very brief, very controlled flicker of something that did not belong in the expression of a man simply doing his job. I did not know yet what it meant. But I knew I had seen it. And I knew it mattered. 20 minutes after the party found its rhythm, Harlan did exactly what I had expected him to do. He waited until the room was at peak density. The point in an evening when conversations overlap and people stop tracking anyone who is not directly in front of them. And then he found me near the east side of the main hall, champagne tray in hand, doing exactly what he had assigned me to do. He was with 4 people that mattered. 2 of them were the Harrove brothers' private equity, significant Western global stakeholders, and the other 2 were a couple I recognized from the fashion press. The kind of names that appeared in profiles about industry influence. A high-value audience. Carefully selected. There she is. Harren said the same opening he always used when he wanted to make a point about me without appearing to. He touched my arm lightly, steering me into the group with the practiced ease of a man presenting something. Gentlemen. My wife. Vivian. She's been keeping the evening running smoothly. He paused. And I watched him calculate the next sentence the way I had learned to watch him. The slight tightening at the corner of his eyes. The breath he took before he let it land. It's the one thing she's genuinely good at. Keeping things moving. Aren't you, sweetheart? He smiled at the Harrove brothers. She doesn't have much in the way of professional experience. Never really took to the working world. But she has excellent instincts for hospitality. Some people are built for boardrooms. Some people are built for. He gestured lightly at my tray. This one of the Harrove brothers laughed. The other looked somewhere to the left of my shoulder. The couple from the press managed simultaneous polite smiles that said they were deciding in real time whether this was charm or something uglier. I smiled. I said it was lovely to meet everyone. I offered the tray. Inside I was counting. Not breaths. Not seconds. I was counting the number of times in 5 years I had stood in a room, while Harlan Weston used me as a prop in a performance designed to remind everyone watching, including me, that I existed at his discretion. 41. This made 42. I excused myself with the tray and moved toward the service area. The kitchen corridor was busier now. Second course preparation in full motion, staff moving fast. The kind of controlled chaos that makes individual conversations invisible. I came around the corner near the dry storage room and slowed without stopping. Cole was restocking a tray of napkins against the near wall. I passed within 2 feet of him. Neither of us looked at the other. Dana's in position. His voice was barely above a murmur. Time to land between two bursts of kitchen noise. Audio's clean. We're good. I kept walking. I did not nod. I did not change my pace. I did not let anything move on my face. But every word had registered with absolute clarity. Dana Marsh, the other member of my team operating inside the estate tonight, positioned somewhere in the upper level of the house, had confirmed her location. The audio equipment was functioning. The operation was running exactly as planned. And right there in that narrow kitchen corridor. I want to tell you something because you have been listening to a story about a woman being humiliated at her husband's party. A woman carrying a tray she should not have to carry. Key absorbing comments she should never have had to hear standing in a room full of people who had collectively decided she was not worth their full attention. That story is true. Every word of it happened. But it is not the whole story. For months ago, I sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building in Los Angeles and looked at a case file that had been building for 2 years. Financial fraud. Money laundering routed through a network of shell companies in 3 countries. A web of transactions designed to look like legitimate business activity while moving tens of millions of dollars through channels that had nothing to do with fashion or distribution or any of the things Western global claimed to be. The problem with financial crime at this scale is that it requires proximity. You cannot prosecute it from a distance. You need access to the internal communications, the private conversations, the decisions that never appear in any document that might be subpoenaed. You need someone on the inside. I was already on the inside. I had been for 5 years. Though not by design. Not initially. But the moment that case file crossed my desk and I saw my husband's name in it, I made a decision. Not an easy one. Not without cost. But a clear one. Tonight was not an accident. The guest list. The timing. The anniversary milestone that gave Harren a reason to have exactly the right people in one room. All of it had been coordinated over 4 months of careful, meticulous planning. Harlan thought he had arranged this evening to put me in my place. He had no idea that I had arranged it first. I came back into the main hall through the side entrance and crossed toward the far window, setting the tray down on a passing cart. Harren was holding court near the bar, 2 fresh glasses of bourbon on the table beside him, laughing at something the taller Harrow's brother had said, completely at ease, completely unaware. I reached into the interior pocket of my dress, a pocket Harlan had once called impractical for something this fitted, which was exactly why I had insisted on it. And felt the edge of the secondary phone. Matte casing. No manufacturer logo. The kind of device that did not exist on any consumer market. It had not vibrated yet. I pulled my hand back and looked across the room at my husband. Then it did. 1 pulse. Then 2. Then a continuous low buzz that did not stop the pattern I had been trained to recognize as a level 1 alert. The kind that in 11 years I had received exactly once before. My hand went still against the fabric of my dress. Whatever was on that screen had not been part of the plan. I needed 2 minutes alone. Not to steady myself. That was not the issue. The issue was confirmation. And confirmation required a screen and silence and nobody standing close enough to read either one. The VIP powder room on the 2nd floor was at the end of a short hallway off the main landing. Past a stretch of framed black and white photography that Harren had selected because someone told him it suggested refinement. I had been in this room exactly twice before tonight. Both times to verify that the monitoring equipment Dana had positioned in the adjacent study was functioning without interference. I locked the door behind me. White marble brushed gold fixtures. Lighting calibrated to make every reflection look slightly more expensive than reality. The kind of room designed to remind guests, even in private, of exactly what kind of house they were in. I pulled out the secondary phone and looked at the name on the screen again. Still there. Still the same. I put the phone away and looked at my hands instead. The ring was on my left hand where it had been for 5 years. 2 carats emerald cut set in platinum with a narrow pave band. Harlan had chosen it himself, which he mentioned frequently. He had a habit of framing his gifts as evidence of effort. Look what I selected. Look what I chose for you. Look how much that should mean. He had given it to me on our 4th anniversary 14 months ago. A private dinner at a restaurant in West Hollywood. A table by the window, candlelight doing its work on the silverware. He had slid it across the table in a small velvet box and watched my face while I opened it with an expression that I now understood had nothing to do with love and everything to do with monitoring. 6 months ago, I had been running a routine equipment sweep in our home, standard procedure. Something I did every 90 days as a matter of professional discipline, using a compact RF detector that lived in the lining of a toiletry bag Harlan had never once shown interest in. The sweep was supposed to take 20 minutes. It took 19. The ring had a transmitter embedded in the setting beneath the center stone. Miniaturization. Not consumer technology. Whoever had sourced it had access to procurement channels well outside the retail market. The device was broadcasting on 2 frequencies. One for location data. One for ambient audio. Harlan had been listening to my conversations for 6 months before I found it. I did not remove the ring. I thought about it for approximately 4 minutes. The time it took me to sit in my car in the parking structure beneath our building and work through the implications. Then I made the decision that seemed most operationally sound given the circumstances. Cleared it with my supervising agent the following morning and proceeded accordingly. From that point forward, I was careful about what I said within range of my own left hand. I gave Harlan the version of my life that I wanted him to have: the anxious wife. The woman without options. The person who had everything to lose in a divorce and knew it. I complained occasionally about money. I asked questions about the business that sounded naive. I said nothing ever. That would have suggested I knew anything he did not want me to know. Meanwhile, the ring kept recording. Harlan's voice from the last 14 months captured in ambient audio, archived on a federal server in a building I was not permitted to identify by name. Every dinner party conversation. Every phone call he took within earshot. Every comment he had made about me to me and about the state of our finances. Including, now that I thought about it, at least 3 separate discussions with Sloan about the timeline for ending the marriage cleanly. He had built me a very thorough case. I looked up at the mirror. The woman looking back at me had good posture and a controlled expression and a diamond ring that was recording everything within 12 feet of her left hand. She looked composed. She looked like someone who had the situation managed. She also looked, if you knew how to read it, like someone carrying something that had nothing to do with strategy. I had loved him once. I want to be honest about that because the rest of this story is complicated enough without pretending the marriage had always been what it became. The man I had married at 32. The one who had been charming in the specific way that people are charming when they are genuinely trying before the trying stops, that man had existed. For a while he had changed gradually, the way damage usually does. Not all at once, but in increments small enough that each one seemed survivable on its own. By the time I understood the full shape of what he was, I was already 2 years into an investigation with his name in it. I was not going to let that be a reason to stop. I straightened up, pressed my fingertips briefly against the cool marble of the counter, and reached for the secondary phone one more time. Cole's message had come in while I was standing there. A short string of alphanumeric characters. The kind that looked like a system error to anyone who did not have the decryption key memoized. I had it memoized. 5 seconds. The message resolved into 4 words and a name. Confirmed. Active. Blacklist. Pinnacle Capital. I stood very still. Pinnacle Capital was not a name I had expected to see. Connected to a $2.5 million loan originating from my social security number. It was a name I knew from a different file entirely. A parallel investigation that my division had been building for 18 months. Targeting a private lending network with connections to money laundering operations across the western United States. Pinnacle Capital was an organization we had been trying to get inside for a year and a half. And Harran had just handed us the door. He had not simply stolen my identity to borrow money he could not get on his own terms. He had borrowed it from the one organization on earth most likely to destroy him for defaulting. And he had done it using the name of the federal agent who was already building his case. I looked at the ring on my finger. Whatever Harlan thought he was doing tonight, he had just made it significantly worse. He was already talking by the time I reached him. That was how it worked with Harran. You did not arrive and then the conversation began. The conversation was already in progress and your arrival was simply absorbed into it at whatever point served him best. I had learned in the first year of our marriage not to expect an acknowledgement. And in the years that followed, I had stopped noticing its absence. He pulled me in with one hand at the small of my back. Light pressure proprietary. The kind of touch that looked affectionate from 6 feet away and communicated something entirely different up close. The group around him was 4 people I did not recognize by name, but placed immediately by category. The particular combination of tailored clothing and careful stillness that indicated serious capital and the preference for not being discussed in rooms they were not in. My wife, Harren said, not looking at me. Vivian. She keeps the household running. A beat among other contributions. The pause was surgical. It landed exactly where he intended. In the space where a compliment should have been filled instead, with the implication that I had been evaluated and found to offer very little of substance. The 4 people smiled the way people do when they are not sure whether to laugh and decide that a smile is the safer option. I smiled too. I said it was a pleasure. And then while Harlan continued the conversation about distribution logistics in the European market, I want to step back for a moment and tell you something. I have been giving you pieces of this story in the order that the evening required the alert. The ring pinnacle capital. The mechanics of what Harlan had set in motion. But there is a larger shape to it that I have not yet shown you. And I think you have earned it by now. I met Harlan Weston 8 years ago at a fundraising event in downtown Los Angeles. I was 30, attending in a professional capacity that I was not able to disclose at the time. He was 36, recently divorced and in possession of the particular energy that people have when they are genuinely engaged with the world rather than merely managing their appearance within it. That version of him was real. I want to be careful about this because it would be cleaner to say that I had always known or that I should have seen it coming. But the man I married at 32 was someone I had chosen deliberately. Not impulsively, not naively. I had spent 2 years watching him before I said yes. And what I had watched had given me reason to believe I was making a sound decision. Harren changed. Not suddenly and not in ways that were easy to name at first. The engagement in his eyes became calculation. The generosity became transaction. The man who had once listened to me the way people listen when they are actually curious about what they will hear became someone who listened only for information he could use. By year 3 of the marriage, I understood what I was living with. By year 3.5, the Western Global case file crossed my desk. I reported it immediately. Conflict of interest, full disclosure, supervisor notified within 4 hours of the initial review. There is a procedure for this. The agency does not ask you to choose between your personal life and your professional obligations. Your supervisor makes the determination about whether you can continue in an objective capacity and you accept that determination. My supervisor reviewed the file, reviewed my record, and made her decision in 48 hours. She kept me on the case. I have thought about that decision many times in the 2 years since. She did not keep me on because it was the easy choice. She kept me on because I had access that no other agent could replicate without years of groundwork, because my operational record was clean, and because she trusted that I understood the line between professional function and personal interest. She was right to trust that I had understood the line from the moment I first saw his name in the documents. The marriage at that point existed as a construct. I wore the ring. I attended the events. I maintained the household and the calendar and the appearance of a life that from the outside looked like nothing more than what Harlan had always wanted it to look like. A compliant woman in a beautiful house. Useful and unthreatening. The 10-year anniversary gala had not been chosen arbitrarily. For months ago, my division identified this event as the optimal moment for the final phase of the Western Global operation. The anniversary milestone gave Harlan a reason to gather in one location every significant financial relationship he had cultivated over a decade. Partners, investors, the network of connections that constituted both his legitimate business and its criminal infrastructure. It was from an evidentiary standpoint an ideal environment. Controlled space, known attendees, a reason for every person on the guest list to be exactly where they were. We had spent 4 months preparing for tonight. Harren's hand had left my back. He was talking about Q4 projections now. Something about Southeast Asian market penetration. And the four people around him were nodding with the focused attention of people who had money involved. I stood at the edge of the group and let my gaze move across the room. It stopped at the far corner near the base of the secondary staircase. Margaret Weston stood alone. No companion. No conversation. No glass raised in the direction of anyone who might require acknowledgement. She was simply standing composed. Contained. The way she always was, with her eyes directed across the room at me. I had attended 14 events in this family over 5 years. I had sat through 43 dinners. I had stood in rooms with Margaret Weston more times than I could count. And I knew precisely what her attention felt like when it landed on me. This was not that. This was something I did not have a word for. Yet something that did not belong in the expression of a woman who had spent 5 years looking through me as though I were a smudge on a window she was trying to see past. She did not look away when I noticed her. She just kept watching. Still patient. With something in her eyes that felt impossibly like it had been there for a very long time. Before I go further, Harren thinks he has every card on the table. He has no idea what Viv is holding. Comment the number 9 right now so I know you're still here, and buckle up, because what happens in the next few minutes changes everything you thought you understood about this marriage. A note for new listeners. This story contains fictional elements crafted for narrative and educational purposes. Some details have been shaped to carry a message worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. But if you're staying, I promise it's worth it. I came in through the side entrance. And from the far end of the corridor, I saw Harren moving fast toward the storage room with the stride of a man who knows he has only minutes left. That walk told me everything. I had seen Harlan Weston move through every register of his emotional range over 5 years. The deliberate pace of a man performing confidence for an audience. The unhurried stroll of someone who believes the room belongs to him by right. The measured, controlled walk of the private office sleeves. Rolled composure assembled like body armor. This was none of those. This was something underneath all of them. The movement of a man whose calculation had shifted from control to exit. Fast enough to mean urgency. Quiet enough to mean he didn't want to be seen. I stayed in the shadow of the side entrance and did not move. The east corridor was one of the estate's less attended passages. A narrow service hallway that connected the main wing to the private quarters. Lit by recessed ceiling fixtures turned to their lowest setting for the evening. The amber light fell in weak pools at 6T intervals, leaving stretches of genuine darkness between them. Harlan stopped 12 feet from the storage room door. Derek Holloway was already there, standing in the doorway. One hand resting on the frame. He had the particular stillness of someone who had been expecting this exact moment and had decided long before it arrived exactly how he intended to move through it. Harlan spoke. I was too far to hear the words, 40 feet of corridor between us. The muffled bass of the jazz quartet still audible from the main hall. But I had spent enough time watching Harren Weston to read the shape of what he was saying without the sound. The bag. Where is it now? Derek nodded once. He turned and disappeared into the storage room. Harlan stood in the corridor and waited. He checked over his left shoulder, then his right. His gaze passed across the stretch of hallway where I was standing without stopping. I was deep enough in the shadow of the entrance alcove that I was effectively invisible, which was exactly why I had chosen it. 11 seconds. Derek came back out carrying the black leather briefcase. It was the same case I had seen him standing beside in the storage room 90 minutes earlier. Matte black silver hardware. The kind of bag that announces itself as serious without being ostentatious. Derek carried it in his right hand. His grip unhurried. His face arranged into the expression of a man completing a routine task for his employer. He held it out. Harlan took it. Not accepted, took. Both hands a slight pull. The involuntary urgency of someone grabbing a lifeline. He held it for a moment at his side, his fingers tightening on the handle. And something in the set of his shoulders changed. The tension that had been building since the study, since the divorce papers, since my final sentence to him, began to release. He thought he had it. He turned. At the far end of the corridor, 12 feet from the exit door that led to the estate's rear parking structure, 2 figures stepped out of the darkness. They were wearing suits. They were not guests. Cole Briggs stood on the left. Beside him, A second IRS criminal investigation agent I recognized from the task force briefing. Tall mid-4S. The kind of face that belongs on someone who has spent 20 years ensuring that people like Harren Weston run out of corridors. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply stood in the exit's path and waited because there was nowhere left for the path to go. Harren stopped. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then he looked down at the briefcase in his hands and I watched the calculation move across his face in real time. The exit was blocked. The bag was his only remaining variable. He set it on the floor, crouched, and released the clasps. The lid opened. No passport. No cash. No documents bearing the name of a man who did not exist. Inside the briefcase, a manila folder 2 in thick. A second folder thinner paperclip at the corner. A federal arrest warrant with Harren Weston's full legal name printed in 12-point type across the top. Beneath it, a separate document. A court-certified copy of the marital financial agreement. Section 14. Paragraph C highlighted in yellow. And beneath that, on top of everything, a single index card. Handwritten. Blue ink. 6 words for Nathan. DH. I looked at Derek. He was standing exactly where Harlan had left him in the storage room doorway. 10 feet back from the scene now unfolding at the corridor's far end. He was not watching Harren. He was not watching the agents. He was looking at a point on the corridor wall approximately 3 feet in front of him at nothing in particular, with the focused non-focus of someone who has arrived at the end of a very long road and is simply letting themselves be still for a moment. Then his eyes closed. Not a flinch. Not relief in any theatrical sense. Just closed for perhaps 2 seconds. The way a person closes their eyes when they set down something they have been carrying so long the weight has become part of how they breathe. I had read Derek Holloway's brother's file 14 months ago. Nathan Holloway, 31 years old at the time of his death. A mid-level fund administrator who had trusted the wrong man with the wrong investment and spent the last 8 months of his life trying to recover $40 million that Harren Weston had already moved 3 jurisdictions away. The medical examiner's report used the clinical language those reports always use. But what it described was a man who had simply reached the end of what he could carry. Derek had carried it instead for 3 years in plain sight. Close enough to the source to be useful. Patient enough to wait for the moment when useful became enough. I understood, standing in that shadow, that this operation had never been only mine. At the corridor's far end, Cole said something in a low, clear voice. The formal language of a federal arrest. Words I had heard in briefings and training scenarios, but which landed differently when they crossed a real corridor toward a real man whose knees were beginning to understand what his mind had not yet accepted. Harlan straightened. He did not run. There was nowhere to run to. He stood and looked at the 2 agents in front of him with an expression that was shifting in real time from calculation to something raw. The specific expression of a man watching every contingency he has prepared for turn out to be insufficient. Cole produced the handcuffs. The sound they made when they closed, that precise mechanical click of the ratchet engaging, traveled the full length of the corridor. It reached me clearly. 1 second later from the main hall beyond the east wing door. I heard the first ripple of confused voices as 200 guests began to understand that something was happening that had not been on the evening's program. The edges of the sound were still spreading when I stepped out of the shadow and started walking. In the middle of everything beginning to come apart, I found Sloane pressed against the wall beside the main entrance. Her eyes moving fast, the way eyes move when the brain behind them knows something is wrong but hasn't yet assembled the specific shape of what. The hall had shifted in the 10 minutes since Harlan's speech. The carefully maintained social geometry of 200 guests arranged in polite semicircles had dissolved into something less composed. Small clusters near exits. Voices pitched slightly higher than the occasion had previously demanded. Heads turning toward the east corridor where 2 of the catering staff had moved with a purpose that did not resemble catering. Sloane had not moved from her position against the wall. She was still holding a champagne flute, though the champagne had gone flat. Her backless dress, which had commanded the room 3 hours ago, looked different now. Not the armor it had been designed to be, but something more exposed. I walked toward her. Not quickly. not with the energy of someone arriving to settle a score. I had spent 5 years carrying things Sloane Weston had said to me in rooms full of people. And I was aware, walking across that floor, that I felt none of what I might have expected to feel in this moment. What I felt was something closer to purpose. She saw me coming. Something shifted behind her eyes. The instinctive preparation of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of the preemptive strike. But the strike didn't come. She looked at me and then she looked past me at the corridor beyond and then back at me. And for the first time since I had known Sloane Weston, she did not immediately have something to say. "What is happening?" she asked. Her voice was lower than I had ever heard it. "Your brother is being arrested," I said. She absorbed that for a moment. "That's not," she stopped. Started again. "Harlan wouldn't, Sloane." I kept my voice even and quiet. "And I need you to listen to me. Not as his sister. As yourself." She looked at me with an expression I could not fully categorize, somewhere between contempt and something that wanted very badly to not be afraid. "I have something you need to see," I said. I reached into the interior pocket of my jacket and withdrew a folded document, 4 pages printed, the kind of printout that looks unremarkable until you read what it contains. I had been carrying it since before the party started. I had debated in the weeks before tonight whether this moment was part of my operational mandate or something outside it. I had decided it was both. I held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. "What is that email correspondence?" I said. "Internal between Harren and a financial partner operating under Western Global's secondary holding structure. The chain runs 14 months. The relevant section begins on page 3. She still didn't take it. "Sloane." I kept my voice at the same register. "Your engagement to Marcus Pennington was not a personal arrangement. It was a contractual one." She laughed, a short reflexive sound that had no humor in it. "You're not serious." "Page 3. I said. She took the document. I watched her read. Page 3 of the email chain contained the language I had flagged in the original evidence review. The section of a message dated 11 months prior in which Harlan referred to the upcoming Pennington engagement as a mechanism for stabilizing the partnership's confidence in Western Global's continued discretion. The next paragraph described Sloane in terms that had nothing to do with a sister and everything to do with a line item. "The Pennington connection via Southwest provides necessary social assurance. Her positioning within the Pennington family network represents a non-financial collateral arrangement contingent on continued operational alignment." I watched Sloane's face as she read it. The first pass. Her eyes moved quickly. The way eyes move when the brain is hoping speed will change what the words mean. The second pass slower. Her jaw tightened. The champagne flute tilted slightly in her other hand before she corrected it. "SW." She said quietly. "Yes. He used my initials." The flatness in her voice was the specific flatness of someone who has just watched the floor change substance beneath their feet. "He put me in a business document. You were designated as a non-financial collateral asset in a partnership arrangement between Western Global and a holding group under federal investigation for money laundering," I said. "Your marriage to Marcus Pennington was intended to create a social and familial bond that would discourage the Pennington family from cooperating with financial investigators." She turned to page 4. "Read it." Did not speak. "You weren't the bride in this arrangement," I said. "You were the guarantee." The sound from the east corridor had grown not louder exactly, but denser, more purposeful. The organized noise of a controlled federal operation moving into its next phase. Several guests near the corridor entrance had begun migrating toward the main hall's center, away from whatever was being managed in the passage beyond. Sloane lowered the document. She looked at me and I saw for the first time the version of Sloane Weston that existed beneath the 5 years of performance. Not the woman who had called me a dated decoration in front of 50 people. Not the woman who had stood in the corner of a private study with her arms folded watching her brother threaten his wife. Something younger. Something that had been there before she learned that cruelty was a useful currency. "Did he know?" she asked. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Marcus, no," I said. "I don't believe he did." She nodded once. The gesture of someone filing information away because processing it fully would have to wait. I became aware of a presence to my left. Marcus Pennington had come to stand perhaps 8 feet away. close enough that the document in Sloane's hands was visible to him. Though not readable at that distance, he had the expression of a man who had arrived at the edge of a conversation and immediately understood he had arrived at the wrong moment. Or possibly the only moment that mattered. He looked at the papers in Sloane's hands. He looked at Sloane's face. He looked at me. I held his gaze for a moment. I did not explain. I did not need to. The document, Sloane's expression, the controlled chaos developing around us were already assembling into a picture that required no narration. Marcus said nothing. He turned and without hurry, without visible urgency, he moved back through the shifting crowd toward the far end of the hall where I had last seen Arthur Pennington standing near the entrance, going to find his father. I turned back to Sloane. She was still holding the document with both hands. She was looking at it, though I did not think she was reading it anymore. The champagne flute was gone. She had set it on a nearby surface at some point in the last 60 seconds without appearing to notice she had done it. For the first time in the entire evening, Sloane Weston had nothing to say. Not a performance of silence. Not the calculated quiet of someone choosing their next move. Simply nothing. The first honest moment I had ever witnessed from her. I was standing in the center of the hall. The silver serving tray set down long ago. The apron I had never once tied when I heard Arthur Pennington's footsteps crossing the floor toward me. The hall had reorganized itself in the last 15 minutes. The elegant social geometry of a catered anniversary gala had given way to something raw. 200 people arranged not by the logic of party planning, but by the instinct of witnesses. They had moved toward the walls, toward each other, toward the exits they were not yet sure they were allowed to use. The jazz quartet had stopped. The amber lighting overhead felt different now. Not intimate, but exposing. Cole and a second agent had brought Harlan in from the East Corridor 2 minutes earlier. He was still in the charcoal suit, still wearing the watch, still carrying in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw the practiced architecture of a man who has not yet accepted that the architecture no longer applies. His wrists were in front of him. The handcuffs were there. And he was working very hard to make them look like a temporary inconvenience rather than what they were. "This is a mistake," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "I want my attorney. I want him on the phone in the next 60 seconds or every person in this building is going to spend the next decade explaining their role in an illegal federal operation." Cole said nothing. He kept his hand on Harlan's arm and kept walking. Then Harlan saw Arthur. Arthur Pennington had entered the main hall from the south corridor. Marcus a step and a half behind him. His expression, the careful blankness of someone processing more than he was ready to show. Arthur moved through the crowd the way he had entered the estate 2 hours ago without announcement. Without the social performance of a man who needed a room to acknowledge him. Harlan's entire face changed. The composure cracked along a very specific fault line. The one that opens when a man who has been performing self-sufficiency finally believes he has found the ground beneath him. "Arthur." His voice shifted register entirely. The CEO cadence was gone. What replaced it was something more naked. The sound of a man reaching for the one connection he believed was solid. "Arthur. Tell them. Tell them who I am. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. You know what we've built together. You know what this operation means." Arthur Pennington walked past him. Not through him. Not around him with visible effort. Simply past the way you walk past furniture that has ceased to be relevant to where you are going. He crossed the hall. He stopped in front of me. 200 people were watching. I know this not because I counted them, but because I felt it, the specific weight of a room that has stopped breathing collectively, where even the ambient noise of fabric shifting and glasses being set down has ceased. Because every person present has understood in the span of 3 seconds that they are witnessing something that will require them to revise everything they thought they understood about this evening. Arthur Pennington was 64 years old, former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Justice, a man whose career had been built on the principle that institutions matter more than individuals and that the law applied correctly was the most powerful force in any room it entered. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the kind of stillness that makes height irrelevant. He placed his right hand flat against his chest. He inclined his head a single deliberate degree. Senior Special Agent Caldwell. His voice was measured, unhurried, calibrated for the room without being theatrical. Operation Pinnacle clearance. Has the authorization sequence been confirmed? I've been waiting for your signal since this morning. The silence that followed was the most complete silence I had experienced in 5 years of undercover work. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of 200 people who have just watched the room they thought they were in become an entirely different room and have not yet found their footing in the new one. I did not look at the crowd. I looked at Harren. He was standing 8 feet to my left, Cole's hand still on his arm, and he was looking at Arthur, then at me, then at Arthur again with the expression of a man whose mental architecture is undergoing rapid, involuntary demolition. His eyes moved to the silver tray on the table beside me, the tray he had handed me at 7 o'clock and told me to make myself useful with. Then back to me, then to Arthur. I watched him understand. Not all at once in stages, the way a building doesn't fall at once but settles section by section. Each piece taking the weight of the piece above it until the structure has no more capacity for redistribution and the whole thing finds the ground. He understood the tray. He understood the apron I had never worn. He understood the 5 years behind him against the south wall. Sloane had lowered herself until her back was against the wall and the wall was doing the work. Her legs were no longer willing to do. Marcus stood 3 feet from her, not touching her, his hands at his sides, his face carrying the quiet devastation of a man who has just learned that the story he walked into tonight is not the story he thought he was in. Arthur was still looking at me, waiting. I held the room for 1 more second, not for effect, not for the 200 people arranged around me like witnesses at something they had not been invited to witness. I held it because 5 years is a long time to carry something in silence, and the moment before you set it down deserves to be deliberate. Authorization confirmed. I said, my voice came out even clear. The voice of someone who has been waiting to use it in exactly this register for a very long time. Operation Pinnacle is active. All assigned units are in position. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and I pulled out the thing that no one in this room, not the guests, not Sloane, not Harlan, with all his calculations, had expected to see in the hands of the woman who had spent the last 3 hours carrying their champagne. That's how it played out. Thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you in the next story.